the asset classes toward the bottom of the chart were not performing well. I'd like to understand exactly how to read the chart.
Yeah, the issue here is that in this chart, again, it's showing average prioritization scores by asset types. The way the tool works is it assigns prioritization score to every single asset in the RTA database. So every single asset will have a score. That score is going to be based on its asset type, and based on its condition, based on how many riders are supported by that asset type and that individual asset, and so on. And so each asset gets its own score. What the chart shows is the average scoring by asset type. So if you took all the train control and all the stations and all the revenue vehicles, on average, that's what the score will be, or was, for at least this particular set of analysis, for each of those different groups of assets. So it might not reflect the prioritization score of an individual asset, but if you average across all the assets of a given type, then that's what the score was like for those assets. So what it does is it gives you a sense of how different asset types are scoring, what's tending to score high, what's tending to score low. It may be because the ones towards the top tend to have more aged assets, a larger proportion of assets that maybe are near or exceed their useful life, and the ones at the bottom don't. But the ones towards the bottom probably don't score as well in terms of their contribution to safety or reliability for a variety of reasons. So it's a mix of all those factors, of prioritization criteria, and how each of these asset types fares relative to those criteria. Now, the fact of the matter is that there's also a set weighting behind that. So some things like condition tend to have a very high weighting, and others may have a lower weighting, like safety and security may have a low weighting, for example. And so that's going to impact the order in which assets are scored as well. So again, assets towards the top were tending to score well, given the way they were scored in terms of priorities and weighted in terms of priorities, and the ones towards the bottom weren't performing as well. Again, when you see stations near the bottom, it doesn't mean that there weren't stations that might be scoring very highly individually. It just meant stations as a whole weren't scoring high. I'm not suggesting that the assets aren't performing well. I'm suggesting that they're not scoring high in terms of reinvestment priorities. They're just not scoring high in terms of prioritization.
Mr. Peskin may have already answered. We'd be really interested in any sort of return on investment data available from those agencies that have already implemented an asset management program. I heard Maximo and a couple of other ones mention. I know those things are pretty costly, and I'm just curious how you would approach trying to convince your agency to really buy in on the asset management concept.
Part of the considerations in determining what underlying data systems are supporting these types of analyses really is tied to, well, what's the intended use of the systems. Large-scale enterprise asset management systems like IBM Maximo or Trapeze AssetWorks and some of the other products, while there may be a relatively high cost to get the license and install them, provide some significant opportunities, not only just in capturing the work orders and more of a pure operating maintenance activity, but also assembling all the detailed information about the assets, information which can then be used on the capital side to project the needs going forward. The types of analyses that we undertook, for example, in the original application of the Boston model, which was more than 10 years ago, or more recent applications of the Boston model in San Francisco or San Jose, all of those applied asset inventories that did not come directly out of enterprise asset management systems. You can certainly undertake somewhat in-depth analysis without the benefit of enterprise asset management systems. But if they're already in place, they provide a very convenient source to obtain the inventory, and if the EAMs are being applied conscientiously, it provides a constantly updated inventory source, which can then be very useful for keeping the state of good repair analysis current. In terms of a specific return on investment measure, none of the applications that I'm aware of has really gotten to the point of actually measuring a return on investment. Part of the issue is that in none of the applications I'm aware of, and I don't think anybody in the industry really knows this very well, is the extent to which the better decision making that's coming out of the application of these tools, to what extent is it resulting in optimizing life cycle costs, minimizing O&M costs, much of the return on investment, I suspect, will be in the form of reduced maintenance costs that result from improved asset condition, primarily from that source. And as a secondary source, to the extent that the service becomes more reliable and is therefore more commercially appealing to the market, maybe some increased fare revenue as well.
Can you discuss the connection between SGR and climate adaptation planning?
Doing asset management and improving your state of good repair is really all about how you invest in your assets so that you minimize your risks. And so this works hand in hand with climate adaptation, because climate adaptation is all about investing in your system so that you can best respond or minimize your risk around climate change. The way to incorporate that, and I think different agencies do this differently, and there's grant money out now to look at this in more detail, but when you're prioritizing your capital program and you're looking at how you prioritize your asset needs, you can build into that criteria around minimizing your risk on climate change, and that can be integrated into what's most important in what you invest in.
When is the next SGR grant going to become available? What time frames?
We recently just completed the last grants, so we're probably looking at sometime around next spring would be the next time frame after these grants are announced, for 2012.
For what range of agencies is Termlight appropriate?
Termlight is really appropriate for an organization of just about any size. I think for fairly small bus operators, you really do not necessarily need to adopt one of these tools, but for pretty much everybody else, Termlight will work for you. So if you are a regional operator with multiple agencies, because Termlight is based off of Term, and Term was designed to do analysis at the federal level, it's designed to take on multiple agencies and modes and grind through the analysis for you. But if you're a single operator, the real intention was to take that federal capability and make it available to you at the local level. It allows you to define whatever level of asset detail that you're happy working with. So what might be appropriate for the federal level of detail may not work at the local level of detail. For example, you might not want to just look at the needs of the individual facilities. You might want to look at the components of those facilities, the roof, the HVAC and structure and so on, the pavement, the parking. So Termlight is really designed for any size organization, and I would encourage you to download the current version, play with it, and then submit any questions to the Term helpline to get you up and operating.
A lot of the analysis is dependent on the quality of cost estimates. How are the FTA or other agencies looking at the quality of cost estimates?
To my knowledge, there's not really any agencies who currently have their arms around the full scope of their asset lifecycle costs. That's one of the reasons that the FTA is using asset management as a tool for reducing the backlog and the state of good repair. Ultimately, as systems mature asset management-wise, they'll get to the point where they have asset lifecycle costs and much better cost data, but that's down the line for most agencies that I've been involved with to date.
Yes. Are there any considerations for the development of a standardization of data with respect to maintenance and reliability and performance data? I don't see that being considered with respect to transit-wide minimum data standardization. Are there any considerations for that?
APTA has put together the Data Good Repair and Asset Management Standardization Group as a working group. They're tasked with really standardizing state of good repair methodology, and in addition to asset breakdown structure, what would be the optimal way or standard way to break down assets that could be leveraged throughout the industry. As far as on the reliability and performance side, at FTA, we're really more on the capital side, so we really don't get into more on the operating side from based on our the function of FTA. So I'm not so sure that we're really looking at specific at the operating side at the moment.
And I would add that the more agencies that get involved in this and the more data and experience we have available, the better information we're going to have, and we can start getting into the details about operations and reliability with some consistency.
How do the MBTA SGR database and Term and its brethren, the two current major tools for performing transit SGR analysis, differ?
in terms of the distinction between the MBTA SGR database and Term, we have the two fathers, really, of the two tools on the line today, myself and Rick Laver. The two tools perform very similar functions in that they both have the ability to look at the current backlog and future needs, and then to impose a funding constraint and project into the future what the impact of constrained funding will be on future asset condition. Both tools were originally developed as Microsoft Access databases. I know Rick can talk to Term, but the MBTA database is in the testing phases now of a web-based SQL version, which has some advantages in terms of distributing responsibility throughout an organization for database management and undertaking analyses which overcome frequent problems in networking and access application.
I think Bob's assessment is really spot on that these tools essentially do the same things. I think they're more similar than they are different in terms of how they operate, the types of assumptions they make, and the calculation steps that they go through. The SGR tool was developed for local use. Term was initially developed for federal use. If you're familiar with the condition performance report, you can look it up if you like. Google condition performance report, you'll get a sense of what's out there. Termlight is just a local agency version of it. It's being designed to make it much simpler to use for any level of user. And again, it will look at your backlog, your projected future backlog under different levels of funding, projected conditions, projected proportions of assets that are past their useful life, all these different types of measures that you tend to see coming out of these tools. So again, they're much more similar to my mind than they are different.
Is it practical to rely on a utility function or scoring formula for prioritizing SGR projects? That is, does this actually work?
I think it's important to recognize that every agency is going to have a unique set of considerations in how it assembles its capital program. My suspicion is that techniques that customize the decision-making to the specific strategic objectives of an organization will have greater credibility and greater acceptance by the stakeholders and the ultimate decision makers. In terms of how well they actually work, it's an interesting question. Part of it is how good a job are we doing in establishing the relative weights among the various considerations. Going back to the question about slide 29 and how well do the various asset classes perform, it's really an issue of how important are the various criteria against which the projects are being rated, and the importance of asset age, particularly age of the asset beyond their useful life. How important is that in the overall context? There are many techniques out there for establishing what the relative importance is of these various considerations. How important is the pure age of the asset, say, relative to its useful life? How important is reliability and safety and security, etc.? And some of what really makes it work is how thoughtful and believable and consistently applied and transparently applied are the techniques that establish the relative importance of the various evaluation criteria and the process by which each asset or each project is being rated against those criteria.
And I think if you talk to agencies that have added this to their process, most people will tell you that it's helped structure the conversation and the considerations for various parties. And it's not perfect, they would probably add, but it's helped. And in many cases, a portion of the program is prioritized using a more structured process, and there are other pieces of the program that are prioritized in other ways. But it's overall been a positive change for agencies that have headed in this direction.
When you're using these types of tools, they can be very sensitive, so changes to weightings can lead to unexpectedly big differences in what the list of prioritized projects are. So if safety jumps up in everybody's mind and suddenly it doubles or triples in its weighting, it really will significantly impact the list of projects that get selected. But one of the other things I think is most helpful is not just looking at how the individual types of assets score or groups of assets or what have you in the short run, but what are the outcomes 10 or 20 years from now in terms of what does and doesn't get done. And to me, that's a very helpful way to calibrate the process in the first place to figure out where is it you want to be 10 or 20 years from now and how does the prioritization help you get there.
Are there benchmark numbers already developed that would allow an agency developing this assessment measure its performance or develop expectations?
The standard that FTA uses, and what I'm gathering from the question is you're speaking specifically to assessing the condition of the asset, so what would be in a state of good repair versus not in the conditions and performance report. The FTA uses the term measure that Brooke, of course, can speak to, between 1 and 5, where anything below 2.5 would be considered in a state of good repair, where it's not operating optimally. So that is one thing that we use specifically for the conditions and performance report. And clearly, if it's not in a state of good repair, the performance level isn't where it needs to be.
Ideally, would we prioritize SGR investments to achieve a certain performance target, or instead to minimize agency and user costs? Are these really just two sides of the same coin?
Yes, these really are two sides of the same coin, but I feel like we're 5 to 10 years away from really being able to assess as we replace assets or to look at different potential futures of patterns of replacing assets, how it will give us a return in terms of performance and minimizing costs. I just don't think we're quite there yet.
I agree with Rick. I think that we casually use this term a data-free zone, but we really are at a point where there's just not enough information out there to finally calibrate. Think of this as a graph where one axis is a measurement of condition and another axis is a measure of, say, unit cost, the cost per mile to maintain a particular asset as a function of asset condition, say the 1 to 5 firm score. As more agencies begin, particularly in the context of applying enterprise asset management systems, as the agencies collect more data, I think we'll be in a better position to answer this question. The next question was, how portable is the needs forecast done for California to other states?
In any application of TERM or any of these tools, absolutely TERM worked well for California, again, because its initial purpose was for a multi-agency, multi-mode environment. It was well suited to California, and the issue with California is many of the agencies and regions had good quality data like MTC. So how portable is it to other states? Absolutely no issues whatsoever there, other than the big issue always is, do you have the data, and putting that data together can be an expensive proposition. So if your major operators within a state, your largest operators have good asset inventories, it's a significantly lesser effort to populate data for your small, medium, and maybe even somewhat larger bus and paratransit operators. So absolutely portable between states.
How can agencies collaborate better at a regional level to leverage capital replacement and rehab funding at a state level and at the federal level?
I think the MTC is doing an excellent job in assembling a regional database and doing the analysis to make the compelling argument for more funding and then to do a better job of allocating that funding at the regional level. I think all of the analysis that we're talking about, again, helps make that compelling case. Getting everybody, all the stakeholders, equally invested in the process, providing the best data that they have available, being active participants in the population of the database and the examination of the implications of the analysis, all of that helps in adding credibility to the analysis for sure.
And to add to that, Bob, is a consistency and approach across agencies within a region, and there are obviously different tools and approaches to doing this, and certainly if you're in a region with multiple mid to large size transit agencies working together to have a common approach would certainly help your ability to communicate need to stakeholders in the region.
Now, an interesting question here is the same technique may be applied by multiple agencies, but going back to one of our prior questions, the specific evaluation criteria may be different, or even if the criteria are different, the relative importance of those criteria may be different between the various constituent transit agencies within the region. And if that's the case, if the priorities for each agency are different, then how do we assemble all this information and make rational decisions about the allocation of regional or state funding to specific agencies if how they're picking their projects is different from each other?
Any recommendations for standard KPIs for reliability
and by asset type?
I'll take a stab at that. We're actually developing for the FTA an asset management manual, and we're hoping, I'll let Kyle speak to when it will be released to the industry. I would hope in the next 6 months. And as part of that manual, we're including a chapter that's specific to how you do asset management and life cycle management for each of the major asset classes, for example, for rail car vehicles, and then separately for maintenance facilities for rail and for communication systems. For each one of those, we're going to be highlighting what are appropriate condition inspection techniques, what are things you should consider throughout the life cycle of the asset to minimize the costs and maximize the performance. And then as part of that, we're also including KPIs or performance metrics. And those aren't necessarily required, but they are industry standards or best practice. That should be all available to the industry, hopefully within the year.
As a result of funding cuts all across the board and the adoption of more component replacement, how are other agencies handling managing these asset inventories that are now more detailed and component-based?
Now, I would say that agencies are actually developing these inventories and they're able to use that information to better manage their assets with less funding. So there is more of a focus on maintenance of components and subcomponents because agencies are not able to just replace the assets outright. They don't have the funding necessarily for that. So having the ability to track the condition and the age and the decay curves for components and subcomponents is actually helping that cause.
And I think another issue here is the industry as a whole is thinking about, okay, if you don't have an asset inventory, what's the best data source I can use to put that asset inventory together? Or if you may already have an asset inventory for capital planning, have you selected the right source? And are you maintaining multiple sources on your asset data? A number of agencies are pursuing the issue of developing these long-term planning inventories based out of Maximo, our maintenance management system, sources where you already touch the data on a regular basis, so you're not maintaining the asset inventory information in multiple places. Your maintenance management system will have data at the component level, but at least for long-term planning, and we've spent a fair amount of these presentations talking about the long-term capital planning, you need to ramp that up to the asset level or groups of assets. But ultimately the decision is, where's the best place to keep your data? Where should you maintain it? What's the most cost-effective? What do you have currently? And then how can you connect it to your long-term needs analysis?
Do you find that there is a gap between engineering, procurement, and maintenance? And will the FTA develop requirements to bridge this gap in a life cycle asset management strategy?
The answer to the first part of the question is yes. I think in the history of asset management and maintenance management, asset management really was driven from the maintenance level up, out to the organization. And I think when you look at one of the points that Rick brought out in the presentations was really the organization or the enterprise level, looking at all the different functional areas that are involved in asset management. So clearly that's a best practice, and I'm sure that Lauren in the manual is going to be addressing that. Will the FTA bridge the gap with the lifecycle asset management strategy? At some point, I believe we will be having an asset management plan requirement. Would that get into the specifics of a gap analysis between engineering, procurement, and maintenance? I would not think so. It would be more likely geared towards developing an inventory, doing a condition assessment. How often do you do a condition assessment? What would the rating of the assets be? More along those lines.
One of the things that our manual is going to be recommending is the development of life cycle management plans for each of your major asset classes. And the idea is that in this plan, you actually consider the full life cycle costs and all of the life cycle activities that you need for that asset. So whereas we traditionally separate the maintenance activities from any of the capital rehab or replacement activities, the idea with this plan is that you actually think through how can we get the most out of this asset by spending the least amount of money across the full life cycle. So it might mean spending a little more in the design and construction phase so that you're spending less in the maintenance. It might mean putting more money into preventative maintenance. These are all things that traditionally the industry has not always done, but it's an important thing to change.
Where will this manual be posted?
I would imagine on the FTA website, on the State of Good Repair website at some point. But as Lauren had mentioned, we're probably looking somewhere out in the neighborhood of about 6 months.
How can tools being developed today help agencies smooth out capital replacement outflows? In developing a compelling argument for more and dedicated funding, how is the message best conveyed to elected officials, to voters, to the business community? For example, what outcomes or how is this measured?
This question really speaks to some of the fundamental capabilities of both the term model and the MBTA State of Good Repair database. One of the scenarios that we certainly are looking at, and I'm here in Vancouver today at TransLink and going to be talking about some analyses looking exactly at this question. What happens if the funding is, say, only at 80% of the average needs each year, or only at 50% of the average needs each year? What projects do we advance? What projects end up getting deferred? And what's the impact of deferring the projects that we can't fund at a particular flat funding level? One of the advantages of having analytical tools like the MBTA model and term is that we're able to very quickly explore what the implications are of different funding levels, be they flat or proportionate to the need or something else. What it speaks to is the importance of using these tools in the context of broader agency-wide financial plans, particularly in the long term, to look out and see what the impacts will be of funding on asset condition.
I would argue that given the fiscal situation and the competition for funds, that we have to be able to provide a more compelling and clear case for why we need investment from state, local, federal resources. It's often difficult to make the argument that you don't have enough to keep up with what you have already. But we should be able to show at various investment levels the effect of those investment levels in service and reliability. And hopefully, as we continue to improve these tools, we can do that in a way that can communicate to a broad range of stakeholders and build the case broadly for funding.
Can we see the draft copy of the manual by Friday?
We're working with the FTA, and we're working through a review process right now. The FTA is reviewing drafts of it, and then we have a very small group of agency reviewers. It's pretty targeted at this point, so I don't know, Kyle, if you want to add to that.
The FTA has given their review on only the first 3 chapters, and there's 6 chapters total. The first 3 chapters are currently being reviewed by FTA, and there's an industry working group that's also in the process of reviewing. Upon that, then we would roll out the next 3 chapters. We'd go through the same review process. So after that review process would be completed, I would say that we would be sending out from our water audience.
Given the various components required to keep an asset in a state of good repair, are there any supply chain coordination tools under consideration by agencies such as rebates, revenue sharing, or other financial incentives with part suppliers?
I think there's a number of questions that have come out on the webinar chat in the last several lines that reflect these issues of managing assets, managing the full life cycle of individual asset types. We're further along in terms of inventories and condition assessments and long-term needs analysis, but transit's probably not so far along with these processes of managing the full life cycle of individual asset types and standardizing those processes and things like obsolescence and these supply chains and so on. So I think we have a long way to go in that area.